Rob Roberts.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. A pleasure to follow the Honourable Member for Tiverton-Honiton, highlighting issues in Devon where around local authority funding, NHS waiting times, ambulances. I'd gently tell him that he should try experiencing those things in Wales, where they're all under control of the Labour government and are markedly worse in every single area. Madam Deputy Speaker, when the previous iteration of the government was in charge, the opposition shouted for the Independent Office for Budget Responsibility to produce forecasts. They demanded it in this chamber, they demanded it on every media interview, on every channel, at every opportunity. The government was being reckless, they said, because they didn't have a forecast from the OBR accompanying their plans. So let's see what the OBR said to the autumn statement delivered by the Chancellor on Thursday. Global factors are the primary cause of current inflation. And what did the opposition say in response to the statement? Caused in number 10, they said. The OBR, whose words they rightly insisted we should wait for and give credence to, disagrees with their position. And it's really interesting, Madam Deputy Speaker, that for the past 12 years, when we've talked about the £153 billion annual deficit when the last Labour administration left office, when we talked about the note left by Labour's outgoing Chief Secretary saying, sorry, there's no more money, not only was it clearly all a big joke to them, as that note confirmed, but all that we heard was, it's not our fault. Global forces. And now, in the aftermath of one of the biggest global health crises in history, and in the midst of a disgusting war in Eastern Europe at the behest of a madman, suddenly, economic problems are nothing to do with global forces. No, it's all caused in number 10, apparently, as they're so fond of saying. Madam Deputy Speaker, it's pathetic, it's nonsense, and it's taking the British public for fools. Fortunately, the good people of Delyn and the public at large see through the mudslinging that's sadly become synonymous with politics these days and recognise from the calm reassurance of the Chancellor at the dispatch box last week that difficult measures had to be taken. But that the measures could certainly have been a lot more hard-hitting than they have been, and I commend the Chancellor not only for reducing the axe to a knife, but for doing so at the same time as ensuring that pensioners are protected from the worst of the inflation. In my Delyn constituency, we have around 25% more pension claimants than the average constituency, so it's been of particular importance, and I thank him for listening to the pleas of my pensioners. But of course, alongside that good news, there are some inevitable challenges. Freezing the personal allowance and the thresholds for other bandings will bring more people into each tax bracket, and will be an additional challenge for household budgets. It's worth pointing out, however, as I'm not sure I've heard elsewhere in this debate or in the media coverage, that when Labour left office in 2010, the personal allowance was £6,475. Adjusted for inflation, that would be the equivalent of £10,219 today. So even with the freeze for another few years, the current personal allowance of £12,570 is still significantly ahead of inflation and has meant that hard-working households keep an extra £470 of their incomes each year. That is a record to be proud of, even if we're having to go through these difficult times in the immediate future. Turning briefly to defence, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm not a defence specialist by any means, but a number of members on both sides have talked about 3% of GDP, 2%, 2.5%. Baffles me, and it baffles my constituents, Madam Deputy Speaker. The armed forces needs a certain number of tanks, ships, planes. They need a certain number of people. None of these things are ever measured in percentages. They're measured in pounds. The Ministry of Defence doesn't need more resources when GDP increases. Neither does it need less money when GDP may fall. The threat is the threat, and fighting over 0.5% of GDP just means that we don't ever need to address the actual pound sterling amount that's needed. It's a perfect example from all sides of the political obfuscation that's endemic in this place. 3% of GDP one year might be the same as 2.5% in another year. But we virtue signal that we're supporting our armed forces when the reality of the actual cash going into the MOD budget may tell a different story entirely. People in Delyn and across the country are wary when we give some figures in pounds and others in percentages. They think we're trying to pull a fast one. and avoid talking about the real issues. Perhaps the Minister can take that back to the Department to be consistent and clear with information and to keep our constituents properly informed.
The honourable gentleman give way.
Certainly.
Does he recognise that he is criticising exactly how his previous colleague spoke when he was boasting about it now being 10% of GDP that is spent on the NHS? The GDP, the income and economy of the UK is considerably smaller due to the impact of what's been going on. So, you know, I think he needs to have a word with his colleague when he's talking about this.
I thank the Honourable Lady for her intervention. I have no issue at all with everything that she said. I can't be responsible for other people's comments, but she's 100% correct. The needs of the services are the needs of the services, and it doesn't make any difference if GDP goes up, down, sideways, or bloody diagonally. The needs are what they are. So I completely agree with the Honourable Lady. Moving on to Wales specifically, excellent news on the one hand, that Wales is to receive an additional £1.2 billion in Barnett consequential funding. But we've sadly had to learn to temper that excitement, particularly in North Wales, as the extra funding is sadly in the hands of the Labour administration in Cardiff Bay, whose maps don't seem to show them that Wales does in fact exist north of the valleys as well. Madam Deputy Speaker, to conclude, as I walked round the market on Mold High Street on Saturday morning, the people were unanimous. I spoke with Fergie, I spoke with Carol, I spoke with Dave and Karen and others whose comments were all very similar. Government provided a huge amount of support during COVID and have done everything they could to help in the current climate. They told me that any government, they said, would have had to have done the same. The incredible confluence of circumstances in the global picture over the last couple of years have meant that we need to get back to a calm, measured and sensible approach to repair the damage of COVID and Putin's war, recognising that the government neither can nor should try to fix every issue in everybody's lives. The people of Delyn understand it, appreciate the steps taken by the Chancellor to mitigate the impact, and I commend him for what he's done in the face of overwhelming economic pressure.